Okay, I know Arthur said he was at a concert of some sort, and he also told me that Lou is unfortunately back in the hospital. So we're
Oh,
going to dedicate the learning again for Lou Rosen. Robert, what's his Hebrew name?
Um, Yehuda Lev ben Yehoshua HaKohen.
Yehuda Lev ben Yoshua HaKohen, and hopefully we'll see him back on the screen soon, along with Gwen. Um, okay, I wanted to look tonight at the opening of Parshat Chukat, and begin with sort of where I think most people go with the Parsha, or at least the opening of it, and then get a lot more technical, which to me I thought was an interesting way of looking at it. It'll all make sense. I'm not sure that that introduction made any sense, but hold on, let me share the screen with you. Okay, can you see it?
No text visible yet. Up there it is.
Okay, good. Um, all right, so the parsha opens right with the mitzvah of the para aduma, the red heifer, which of course is one of the great mysteries in the Torah. Um, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe ve'el Aharon lemor, Zot chukat haTorah, asher tziva Hashem lemor, Daber el bnei Yisrael v'ichui elecha para aduma tamima, asher ein ba mum, asher lo aleha ol. This is the chukah, the law, the ritual law of the Torah, which God commanded, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel; they shall take for you a red heifer, which is unblemished, which has no wounds, no defects, which has never bore a yoke. Um, ונתתם אותם אלעזר הכהן, והוציא אותה אל מחוץ למחנה, ושחט אותה לפניו, and give it to Eleazar the Kohen, and he will take it out of the camp and slaughter it. ולקח אלעזר הכהן מדמה באצבעו, והיזה אל נוכח פני אוהל מועד מדמה 7 פעמים. He should take some of its blood and sprinkle it in the Mishkan. ושרף את הפרה לעיניו, את הרע בשרף בדמה al פרשה ישרוף, and he should burn the entire cow, its blood, its skin, its bones, the entire thing. Vilakach Kohen ate azov, and he should take is that a hyssop tree? Azov? Um, yeah, cedar. Sorry, cedar and hyssop. Um, it's erez v'izov, right? Sorry, erez is cedar, azov is hyssop, ushni tolat, and thread, the crimson thread. Yishlich el toch shreifat apara, and he should throw that into the fire which is consuming the cow. V'chibes begadav ha-kohen, and the kohen should wash his clothes. V'rachatz b'sor b'mayim, v'achar yavo el machaneh, v'tameh ha-kohen ad ha'arev. And he should wash his clothes and then return to the camp. And the kohen who prepares this cow, we'll call it the cow mixture, the cow ashes, remains tameh, remains impure until evening. Right. So this is what right the great chok, the epitome of a chok of an unknown, unexplainable mitzvah is the para aduma. Right. So there's a few different understandings about what makes it a chok. Right. So one possibility, and they might all be correct. One possibility is just we don't understand why this is what would make someone who came into contact with the dead tahor, right? Why is this the way to go about purifying someone? Right? It's very arbitrary, very random. Why is this the procedure? Why is this the way that a person becomes pure? So that's one possibility. The second, which gets a lot of airtime, is the putting aside the question of how it all works, but the fact that the great irony that it is mitaher et hatmeim umitameh et hatehorim. It purifies those who became impure, right? It is what is sprinkled on a person who comes in contact with the dead in order that they um, will no longer be tame and will become pure. But at the same time, it renders those who will deal in preparing it, in sprinkling it, in touching it, who have to do so in a state of tahara, in a state of purity. By the end of that, they become tame, they become impure. So that's what most commentaries, right, based, the Gemara, most assume that that is sort of the chok element. What makes it so mysterious is the fact that it has this ironic characteristic to it that it renders those who are pure or impure pure, and those who are pure it makes impure, right? And that's said about many of our favorite institutions. We used to joke at Brandeis that's it's like the Paraduma, right? It's like modern Orthodox, whatever you want, whatever Jewish institution you're dealing with. Yeah, Beatrice, you're on mute.
The word chok appears often, right?
Yes,
Several times.
yes.
We're not saying that every time chok appears, it's something with this.
So that's a good question. That's where we're going to go with tonight is why, right, is this the good definition of the word chok? Should we understand chok to mean something which is unexplainable? Or is there
It's a
different
kind of
meaning?
commandment.
It's a kind of commandment, yeah, but so
And
we
sometimes a commandment, at least in human context, can be logical and sensible and reflect the variety of values. And other times it could be um, and something that has no inherent magic or inherent logic, but it's established. This is done in order to represent purity, to represent patriotism, to represent a variety of things. And so I'm puzzled by the question of trying to get to the bottom of the ultimate meaning of commanded ritual.
okay.
Uh, it, it,
You're in good company.
yeah.
Right. So one very common and very popular response is there is no explanation, and we do it because Hashem said to do it, just like a soldier in the army doesn't question their commander, right? And there's interesting applications or discussions about that if you think your commander is giving an immoral command. But in general, right? So that is one understanding is that we have mitzvot that God tells us to do, and God says jump. You don't ask why, you just ask how high. And that's a very legitimate religious position to take. So Robert has maybe you're embodying the simple the pashat amuna, right? Just simple pure faith, right? We don't need to know any reasons or explanations, um, and that may very well be the case. And then I guess the question would be: is that the true for every mitzvah, Robert, or only certain mitzvah? And
It depends on a context. I'm curious. A mikveh is used for purification.
yeah,
So if someone becomes mitame because of contact with the dead,
mm-hmm.
if they swim in the ocean or a lake or an artificial mikveh, does that have any effect on their status of purity or impurity?
So it does not help with tumat mate. Right, tumat mate requires the paraduma. We don't have a paraduma. We don't have access to that ritual. So the assumption is every person living since certainly the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, maybe prior. I don't know when the last Paraduma was available or how long one Paraduma lasted to be able to do the ritual, but we don't have it. So no, mikvah does not help with tumat meat. It does help with other forms of tuma. Um, so there's interesting discussions about that. I think one year, I don't remember if it was Parsha Chukat or a different Parsha, we spoke about what does all this mean for a Kohen working as a doctor? Can a Kohen go to medical school? Because generally, even though the assumption is we're all Tamei Mate, we all have impurity assumed to have come in contact with the dead at some point in our lives. Nonetheless, you're not allowed to add on to that, right? So just because you might think, oh, I'm already Tame, so what's the difference if I become Tame again? No, it's like Chilul Shabbos, right? Every act of Chilul Shabbos that you do, you light a cigarette, doesn't mean, well, I've already broke Shabbos this week, I can get in the car and barbecue a steak. Each act of Chilul Shabbos is in itself something which you're liable for. So
But
each,
they're permitted for. Um, there was a shaila asked of Rav Moshe Feinstein, as I understand it, by a physician who worked at um, Mount Sinai Medical Center, I think,
mhm,
in Manhattan, but he lived in Teaneck or one of the communities in that vicinity, and he was a specialist in particular field where there were people who were deathly ill, and the treatments were difficult and had to be monitored and so on. So a call goes out from the hospital to the physician.
yeah,
He picks up the phone and he's told uh, the patient is exhibiting thus and such and thus and such and thus and such, which are all symptoms of a very seriously declining condition. Um, what do we do? If the physician has an idea of what might be done that doesn't require him to be there, he can give directions but if it's something that he doesn't trust that anyone but he himself who has the training and the
mhm,
experience can do it,
right.
if it's before Shabbos, he can drive in, but he might end up having to stay once if night falls. Um,
So
can he go home?
there's a separate that's a separate question. Meaning,
Yeah.
yeah, that is an interesting question, and that gets into both issues of Hilchot Shabbos and issues of Pikuach Nefesh and issues of Oneg Shabbos. The general assumption is a doctor who has to be summoned to the hospital, has to go to the hospital to treat patients, um, can do so on Shabbos, can drive, can you know, and that's an interesting question in the laws of Shabbos. Is that because the laws of Shabbos are suspended or are pushed aside, right? Does it mean that, should they try to minimize the malacha in any way that they can, or is it just not Shabbos for them at this point because they're on their way to do the mitzvah of saving a life? Then there's a separate issue, and the general, right, the psak, the famous psak of Moshe Feinstein and of others is that once a doctor has gone to the hospital and done what they have to do, then the doctor can return home, even if that means driving themselves home.
Not just can. My understanding is Rabbi Feinstein ruled that he must,
Yeah, and so that's
because
because of Oneg
if it
Shabbos,
becomes a
because
tircha on
then
his
he won't do it.
family and
Right, right.
yeah,
So that's a fascinating issue, right? That comes up with the Hatzalah members as well. Um,
yeah.
right, really interesting stuff. But that right, so
Is
that's
that an analogous? I'm excuse me. Is it analogous to the Adim of the Molad of the new moon?
that
Uh,
meaning
uh,
that they can travel.
can they travel, ride a horse or a camel or
Yeah,
whatever to
yeah,
get to the Bet Din
similar
in
issues,
Yerushalayim?
similar issues. Um,
Hmm.
okay, so okay, so that's an interesting related aside topic of all sorts of all the rules of doctors. Um, but nonetheless, right? So we assume that everyone in our day and age is Tamei mates. And even though, right, so a Kohen can't, even if they already are Tamei, can't add on to their tuma, as it were. And so, right, interesting questions. Can a Kohen serve as a doctor? Some say yes, some say no. Right, I mean, it's really the problem of medical school more than being a doctor. Um, but can a Kohen do scientific research? Right, all sorts of interesting questions. Where they might come into contact with the dead. Questions of visiting concentration camps, questions of visiting museums where there might be mummies or other, skeletons. So some very interesting um, and surprisingly practical questions that arise out of all this. But we're going to sort of zoom back a little bit more and focus on the question of the chok. So very famously, the Gemara says about this, about the para aduma, that this is what Shlomo HaMelech referred to in Kohelet when he wrote in source number 2, Kol ze nisiti b'chachma, amarti ech kama, v'hi rechoka mimeni. All this I tested with wisdom. I thought I could fathom it, but it eludes me. The Gemara says this refers to para aduma, that Shlomo his entire life tried to understand the logic of the para aduma. Again, some say it means how the mechanics or the logic of how it works, and some say more of the feature of it, mitame et mitaher et atmeim, umitame et atahorim. The Rambam, very interestingly, the Rambam tells us in the end of Hilchot Me'ila. Let me show the English here. Ra'ui la'adam litbonein b'mishpatei haTorah Kedosha, leida sof inyanam kefi kocho. It is appropriate for a person to meditate on the Torah's laws and to understand them according to his or her ability. Davar shelo yinsa lo tam, lo yeda lo ila al velo yada lo ila, al yihi kal be'ina velo yaros la'alot el Hashem penifotzbo. Right? Just if something is difficult for a person to understand, you shouldn't treat it lightly, um, but rather, right? Also, he should know the limits, right? If I'm not going to understand it, it's he shouldn't push forward too much. He shouldn't think that just like any other secular mundane matter, you can really come to understand that's not necessarily going to be the case. And if we skip down in the English, it's the next bolded part. In the Hebrew,
Sorry,
it
I didn't
is,
understand what
yeah.
The um the Yifrots. What's that mean?
So lifrot is to burst forth. You
So
should
I
not
understand.
break through to ascend to God, lest God burst forth against him, right? So that's generally understood to mean, right? Maybe there might be Kabbalistic, mystical understandings or explanations, but if it's beyond you, don't try. It's like the rabbis who entered into Pardes. It's going to lead to bad things.
Okay.
Okay, so then the Rambam, continuing on in this, he says, Hamishpatim, Kein hamitzvot shetaman galui b'tovat asiyatan b'olam hazeh yidu'ah, right? A mishpat is a mitzvah whose reason is obvious and the benefits are well known. Kigun isor gezel ushvichu damin v'kibud avaim. And the examples he give is the prohibition against stealing, the prohibition against murder, the obligation to honor one's parents, right? Those are are classic mishpatim, classic logical. Anyone could understand it. Other midrashic sources tell us that even if they hadn't been given as mitzvot, we would be obligated to do these anyway, because it's basic common decency, basic common morality. I think a different shir on a different parsha. I don't remember which parsha, but this is a topic that really fascinates me. The whole question of whether Torah recognizes natural morality, some sense of ethics beyond or independent of the Torah, right, which would be binding on non-Jews. So that's what the mishpatim are. Hachukim hina mitzvot she'ein taman yadua. A chok is a mitzvah whose reason is not known. Amru chachamim, chukim chakoti lecha ve'ein lecha reshut lahayer bahen. The sages said about this that God has given us chukim, and you have no permission to try to understand them, to think after them. Yitzro shel adam nokfo bahen, and a person's own Yetzer Hara, sort of teases him, pushes him to want to understand it. And the other nations, the non-Jews, sort of poke fun at you about these mitzvot. Kigon isor basar chazir, such as the prohibition against eating pork. Right? That's something that no one can make good logical sense of. Ubasar b'chalav, and the prohibition against eating a cheeseburger, eating meat and milk, the egla rufa, and the mitzvah of the egla rufa, right? The decapitated calf when a body is found murdered outside the city limits. Upara aduma, our mitzvah of para aduma, the sa'ir hamishtaleyach, the scapegoat on Yom Kippur. And David was right. David was made fun of by other nations, right? So there are mitzvot that the Rambam says we will not understand, and even if we're mocked, even so, we just have to do them because God said to do them. Okay,
There's a
continue.
performative element to them as opposed to necessarily a substantive element. If you're looking for substance, that what is it? The medieval alchemists who wanted to turn lead into gold and so on, and they had magic formulae that supposedly would do that. But if you have a change in the financial system, so that gold is now considered like sand, and
Right,
lead is considered the highest form of
right.
metallic material. Um, if people act as if it's that way and treat it that way and value it that way, it works to an extent. These are issues of um,
Yeah,
protocol.
so there are sources that get into all these questions, right? Does God, right? There's a medrash that says, does God really care how you kill the animal, right? Does God really care if you slit the front of its neck or the back of its neck? Um, does that really matter? And that medrash says that the mitzvot were given l'tzarif b'net adam, that they were given to refine a person, right? That there's some moral refinement that takes place when you do the mitzvot. And so again, so some understand that to be that the very details or the very substance of the mitzvah is what creates that effect. And some say no, it's just that you're submitting yourself to a higher will, and it's the act of submission which creates it.
Is it rebellious against the chok if one behaves obsessive compulsively? There are people who have a sense that their hands they're dirty,
Hmm.
and they wash and they wash and they
Yeah.
wash. They use corrosive soap and chemicals and other things. There's a limit to what is rational, and there's a point at which it becomes dangerous.
Yeah.
Um, and yet, the idea that one must be clean, it's respectful, it's appropriate, and for those people who are obsessive compulsive to have a sefer halachot that lays out this is what is done. Anyone who exceeds what is commanded, it's not a reward. What you're expected to do is what you have to do. You
Yeah.
have to do
So
what you're expected to do. And so by setting up these parameters or these
yeah, so
designated
one
actions,
issue is certainly the mental health, right? Halacha and OCD are either a very good match or a very bad match. right? Many people with OCD inclinations or diagnoses are very attracted to the religious life because there is such an emphasis on the details, and it can certainly be unhealthy. Um, so yeah, so that's one interesting limit, right? Another interesting debate about this is came up with Chassidut, right? That it was accused of being antinomian. That it, right? Because Chassidut emphasized connecting to God and spirituality, right? We could apply this not only to Chassidut, but this was like a very passionate issue that if you think you understand the real purpose of the mitzvah and you think you can get there in a different way, so then the halachic details might fall by the wayside. And that's another sharp critique and important issue that surfaces around this. Um, so there's a lot. There's a lot to say about, and maybe we should revisit this um, about understanding chok, understanding this idea of tamei hamitzvot. Should we know the reason, the rationale for the mitzvot? Can we know it? How does that all play out together? Is a very, very important, very rich, very fascinating topic. I wanted to put this aside though, okay? Or maybe we'll come back to it at the end. But this is again, you look for Parshat Chukat on the internet and all the shiurim. This is what overwhelming majority of the commentaries and talk about is Para Aduma as the ultimate chok, as the ultimate unintelligible, what's the proper word? Ununderstandable, non-understandable, unintelligible, whatever,
Comprehensible?
incomprehensible mitzvah, um, irrational or irrational, and that's that's there as we've scratched the surface. There's a lot to say about this. I wanted to take it in a very different direction, and to do that, I'm not sure if either of you are familiar with Menachem Leibtag. He is a teacher of Tanakh primarily at Yeshivat Har Etzion. He was like sort of um, the first rabbi who really effectively um, used the internet to spread Torah, meaning like he was one of the very first, like regular sending out email Parsha Shir every week, developed a website, which is quite good. And he like really, what Yeshivat Har Etzion is known for is obviously rigorous study of Gemara, but really introduced rigorous study of Tanakh into a legitimate yeshiva activity. And so he's not the pioneer. He's a student of Yoel Ben Nun and the others who really are led the Rav Breuer, but he certainly brought it to the English speaking world in really interesting ways. So he brings us back to Parshat Tzav. Parshat Tzav, you'll remember, the second Parsha in Sefer Vayikra, and it goes through, right, it opens up with the mitzvah of Trumat Hadeshen, of cleaning the ashes from the Mizbeach at the beginning of the day, and then it goes through how each of the various sacrifices were offered. So Rabbi Leibtag notes that in Parshat Tzav, we're down in source number 5, the word Torah appears over and over again in describing the sacrifices that are being performed. Right, Moshe Lemor. I brought just one of them in its entirety, and then in the next page, it just gave you all the other times where it says Zot Torat, Zot Torat, Zot Torat. Right, that every sacrifice is introduced by the word Torah. Savet Aaron v'banav lemor. So command Aaron and his children, saying, Zot Torah ta'olah. This is the Torah, the law, the ritual of the Olah. Ki ha'olah al mokda, al hamizbeach, al kol alayla raboker v'ish tamitu kadbo. This is the rule of the Olah, of the elevation offering, which is placed on the altar and is burnt the entire night. It's consumed the entire night. Lavasha kohen mitovad, michnesei vad, uliobasha besaro. The kohen wears his linen clothing for performing this. V'yirim et hadeshen asher tochal ha'ish et ha'olah al mizbeach v'samoit al mizbeach. He should remove the pile of ashes which is on the altar. Ufashatet begadav lavash begadim achirim. And he has to change out of his pure white clothes and put on different clothes that can become dirty and tamei. And he should take this pile of ashes out of the camp to a pure place. Chukad bo lo tichbe, and the fire on the altar should burn and not be extinguished. Arthur, welcome.
Hello, I screwed up. Anne didn't have it. I forgot to leave my computer out for her to watch.
Oh no. Okay, I'm sorry.
Well,
All right.
Yeah.
We are recording. So
Wonderful.
yeah.
I'm being in the kitchen.
Okay. Uviar leha kohen etzim baboker, and the kohen should put new wood on the altar each morning. Barach leha olav yiktir chavei shlamim, and then he'll offer the elevation and the peace offerings. Eish tamitu kol al mizbech lo tichbeh. Perpetual fire should be on the altar, should never be extinguished. Okay, so again, each one of the sacrifices here is introduced. I think I brought the wrong pasuk in 17. It shouldn't be Vayidrash Moshe anymore, but it should be the next one, which says Zot Torah. I don't remember which one that is. I think the Shlamim. Okay, so each one of them is introduced with the term Torah, and then at the end, right, the entire section concludes with in chapter 7, verses 35 to 38. Zot mishchat Aharon u mishchat banav meishe Hashem v'yom ikrivotam l'chahin laHashem. These are the prerequisites of Aaron and the prerequisites of his son from Hashem's offerings by fire. Asher tzivah Hashem lateit lahem b'yom mashcho otam me'it b'nei Israel, which God told them on the day which He anointed them. Okay, so this right signifying that they're the rightful Kohanim. Zot haTorah la'olah lamincha lachatatz la'asham lamiluim la'zevach hashlamim. This is the Torah for the Olah, for the elevation, for the mincha, the meal offering, the sin offering, the asham, the guilt offering, the miluim, the special offering for the dedication of the Mishkan, ula'zevach hashlamim, and for the peace offerings. Asher tzivah Hashem et Moshe b'Har Sinai b'yom savato b'nei Israel, which God commanded Moshe on Har Sinai, in the day which He commanded the Jewish people, Akriv et korbanehem la'Hashem b'midbar Sinai, to offer their sacrifices to God in Midbar Sinai. Rabbi Liebtag says, and Anne, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay,
now I am, Rabbi.
Okay, so maybe this is like the first thing they teach you in doctoral programs about Bible, but to me this was very interesting. He makes the observation that when the Torah uses the term Torah to describe these sacrifices, it means a process. Okay?
Okay.
The specific meaning of Torah is a procedural law, a series of actions necessary for the completion of a given process. So since each of these sacrifices is a multi-stepped process, which the animal has to be prepared, it has to be inspected, it has to be slaughtered, the blood has to be collected, it has, some of it is burnt, some of it is eaten. So, right, it's a multi-step process. It's a procedural mitzvah. That's what Torah is. Is that doctoral Bible 101, Ann, or is that something new and interesting?
No, actually, I've never heard that description before. But,
okay.
But always a caveat that the word Torah means a teaching. It's
Right,
and from that, many other things can be derived. But it's not always to be translated in exactly the same way each time.
right. Okay, so let's keep that in mind and go back to the beginning of our parsha. Okay, so Zot Chukat HaTorah, Asher Tzivah Hashem Lemor. This is the chukah of the Torah. Let's read Torah as a procedural mitzvah with multi steps, which God commands. And what is it? Unitatem, right? So, what does Elazar do? Hotzi otam michutz hama- You take the para aduma. Elazar takes it out of the camp, and he slaughters it, and he takes some of its blood and he sprinkles it, and um, he adds the cedar and the hyssop, and he adds the water, right? So there's a multi-step process that Elazar does in preparing this para aduma recipe, right? The mei chatat, the waters of purification. And then in verse 13, I don't think we read this far the first time we looked at it. Sorry, not 13, 14. We have a second, Zota Torah, Adam ki amut ba'ohel. So this is the Torah. This is the procedural process. If a person dies in the ohel, in a tent, in a house, right, covered by a roof, a structure which is covered by a roof, kol haba lo ohel v'asher ba'ohel yitma shivat yamim. Anyone who is in the tent is tameh for 7 days. And if there's any open vessel, that also, right, its contents become impure. Or if someone comes in direct contact with a corpse, right, even if they're in the open field, not in an enclosed space, but if they come in direct contact, they also are impure for 7 days. So they take for the impure person some of the ashes of the para aduma, natan alav maim chaim al keli, and add water. Lakach ezo v'taval b'maim. He takes hyssop and he dips in water. There's a second procedure. So zot chukat Torah, the Torah that's described, right? It's describing two different procedural rituals, mitzvot. Number one is the preparation of the water, how you go about preparing the para aduma, right? And that's on standby, right? That's a separate thing that the Kohen does to ensure that it will be there. And then the second procedure is when, in fact, it needs to be put to use, it tells us how it should be used. Okay, so that's how we should, according to Rabbi Liebtag, and I think it's a good shot, should read the Torah, Zot Chukat HaTorah. What about Chuk? What about Chok? What about the Chukah? So what does that have? What does that mean? So before we get there, we'll just note the point that I think it was Beatrice raised previously, which is that we have many, many mitzvot that are described as Chok, right? And some of them aren't as unintelligible or far-fetched as the para aduma, right?
Right.
So the best example of that would be all of the chagim. All of the holidays are described at one point or another as a chok. In Shmot, right, we have Hayal Lachem L'Zikaron L'Chagotim Oto Chag LaHashem L'Dorotechem Chukat Olam Tachoguhu. The Korban Pesach should be something which is celebrated every year. It is a Chukat Olam. It's translated here as an institution for all time. With the Chagim, right? So it begins with the Omer, right? So when you come to the land, you're gonna cut the Omer. You're gonna count 50 days. You're gonna bring the Omer offering. And then in verse 14, v'lechem v'kali v'charmel lo tochlu ad etzem hayom hazeh. So, right, you can't eat any freshly harvested wheat until the Omer offering is brought. Adav yachem et korban elokechem, until you bring the sacrifice of God. Chukat olam l'dorotechem b'chol moshvotechem. It is a law for all time throughout the ages. Right, with I think the first one here is the I forget which holiday this is describing. 20, or whatever. But all the Chagim are described at one point or another as Chok. Then we also have before that in Sefer Breshit. Remember when Yosef brings his plan to Paro after he interprets the dream and is made as the viceroy. So it says that Yosef acquires all of the land of Egypt for Paro, except for the land of the Kohanim, not of our Kohanim, but of the Egyptian priests, because verse 22 and source number 8, Rak admata Kohanim lo kana, he did not acquire the land of the priests, ki chok la Kohanim eit Paro, because it is a law for the Kohanim from Paro. Avachlu et chukam asher natan lahem Paro, al kein lo machu et admatam. They live off the allotment which Paro had made to them, therefore they did not sell their land. I don't know how, I'm not sure how exactly it should be translated there. I think it's more of a legalistic thing. I don't like the translation of allotments, but it's some binding agreement that they have with Paro. And then in Yirmiyahu we have Koramar Hashem. This is what God makes an oath. Im lo briti omam v'layla chukot shamayim va'aretz lo samti. As surely as I have established my covenant with day and night, the laws of heaven and earth, chukot shamayim va'aretz.
Yes,
God
that's
zera
intriguing.
Yaakov v'David avdi em as chukat mikachat mizaro mishlosh moshlim el zera Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov. So I will never reject the offspring of Jacob and my servant David, right? So the laws of astronomy, of the heavens and earth are eternal, just like God's covenant is eternal with the Jewish people. So, right, we have the use of chok in many different settings, many different contexts. But Rabbi Leibtag suggests, and it's not totally clear if this is true for all the usages, but back to our Zot Chukat Torah. The word chok describes a fixed law or statute. For example, in regard to matmeit, if a person touches a dead body, he becomes tameh for 7 days. This is a chok as opposed to a Torah, which means a halachic consequence. It is a simple fact and not a procedure to be carried out, right? The chok is that if someone comes in contact with the dead, then they are tameh, then they are ritually impure, and they have to go through this purification process, right? It's not that it's necessarily something which is completely unintelligible, can't be explained at all, but as opposed to a Torah, which means a procedural mitzvah with many steps to it, the chok is the consequence of it, is the halachic reality that is created by life situations. Right? So then he says, based on this definition, the reason for certain chukim may in fact be beyond our comprehension. However, many other chukim can actually make a lot of sense. Therefore, we find some chukim that are quite logical, while others are not. Surely an illogical law is not the definition of a chok, right? So unintelligible, unexplainable, inexplicable. I'm struggling with all these ways to say not to be understood, right? Maybe a subset, maybe a subsection of chok, but chok by definition does not mean something which cannot be understood or cannot be explained.
It's beyond the understanding of some people. A person who is a child, literally a young child, sees things, is a witness to things, but will not have an extensive comprehension of what is seen. Freud talks about the distortions regarding personality and with effects on behavior and emotions that a child might incur because of witnessing certain events and behaviors without understanding what's going on, and it leaves an effect
Yeah, yeah,
which they have to work
right.
through.
Our actions have consequences.
Well, uh, the action
Good.
is if you're standing at a place where a meteorite strikes the ground, you have a small chance of surviving. If you're
Okay.
on the Titanic and you don't know how to swim thousands of miles, uh, you things happen. And one of the things I think I'm sensing with regard to the concept of Torah is that it the there was disorder, there was tohu vavohu way back when, and when the Rabboni Shalom decrees vayihi whatever, and it was,
Yeah.
it said it's an imposition of order, and on the basis of that order, things function
Yeah.
hopefully
Yeah.
better.
We hope so. Yes.
But the
So
shorish means for something to be carved,
right.
which is always an interesting problem because not every one of the Aseres Adibros are Okim, you know. I mean,
Right.
but in that regard, so it's obviously meant to be taken at a different level. Decree is a good word in that regard because one has the sense that this is a something tied to someone's will, and that's the part of it that certainly the Rebbe hones in on, and why eventually we can say Huchat HaTorah, meaning that all of the mitzvahs that are in the Torah are in some sense chukim,
Okay.
that
So
whole
you're
line
right.
of thinking,
Right.
but it's important, I think, not to lose sight of the root metaphor here. Is something that is carved as opposed to something that is written on a parchment that can be, its layers can be taken off, it can be changed as time goes on. It's certainly
If
not like
you
oral
apply
communication.
a turning wheel against a piece of redwood that has been carved, let's say 4 inches deep, whatever has been carved, if you have that friction applied long enough, it's gone in the same way that the writing with a pencil or the writing even with the most indelible ink is vulnerable,
Hmm.
is mortal, quote unquote, as everything in the world and the universe is. Um, we are, what is it? We're on a narrow bridge. It's unstable. It's not visible. If you follow the Indiana Jones image from one of those movies, trying to cross an invisible bridge, how do you do that? You have to have faith that it's there, and you have to stay on it. I,
Yeah.
it it's very stressful to be alive.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. So let's just bring it back, right, just to drive the point home. So back to our right, the opening section of our parsha, right? So Zot Chukat Torah. This is, and we'll translate it as Rabbi Litak is suggesting. This is the consequence of the procedural law. Okay, and then so the Torah gives us the right the Torah, the procedure of how this red heifer mixture is created, and then in verse 13, um, or maybe we could say in verse 11, Hanogea b'meit l'chol nefesh adam b'tamei shivat yamim. If someone touches a human corpse, they will be impure for 7 days. Hu yitcha bo b'yom hashlishi v'yom hashvi'i yitar. Right, he will be rinsed with this red heifer mixture on the third day and the seventh day. If he doesn't do it on the third and the seventh day, he can't become purified. Kol hanogea, verse 13. Kol hanogea b'meit v'nefesh adam asher yamut. Lo yitchata, anyone who comes in contact with the dead and does not purify themselves. Why the word for purify here is yitchata is maybe next year's Parsha Shir. Mishkan Hashem Timei, he has defiled God's Mishkan. Nichatan Nefeshim Israel, and he will be cut off from the Jewish people. Kimeni da lozo rak alav, because he was not purified with this water mixture, and he will remain impure. Okay, so that's the consequence of coming in contact with the dead. That's the chok, and then again we have the Torah's description of the procedure of how the person is purified and how the water is sprinkled on them. And then in verse 21, I don't think I'm going to get the Hebrew and the English on the screen together. So I'll give you the English. In verse 21, Vayatalahem lechukat olam. This should be for them a chukah, a consequence of eternity. Umazei mei hanida yechabes begadav. The one who sprinkles the water will have to wash his clothes. And the one who touches on this water mixture will become tamei until evening. So this is the consequence of going through this ritual procedure is that the person who sprinkles it becomes impure, even though they started out pure. And whatever the impure person touches will become impure. And the person who touches it is impure until evening. So it's the consequence of this ritual procedure. And that's right, that on the one hand, I think very nicely explains these two phrases, Chukat HaTorah. Right, I think it's very helpful not only here, but also in understanding of Sefer Vayikra. And it also helps us understand why the rabbis really focus in on this feature of the Para Aduma, that it has the capacity to both mitaher et hatmeim, to purify those who are impure, while at the same time mitameh et hatahorim, it renders impure those who were pure. Okay. A little bit of a different approach to things tonight. I hope you got something out of this. Any final thoughts or questions? I guess not. All right. So
yeah, it was very interesting. I'm
yeah,
turning it over in my mind still.
Yeah, it's the type of thing, like there's not really just sort of like this is what it is, right? You could agree or not agree, but it's if you're convinced, then you just okay, this is how we have to read it, and there's nothing else to say about it really. So anyway, Parshat Chukat.
It's interesting that Moshe knew the reason for it. We do have a tradition that Hashem told it to him.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, I hope it gives us what to think about or new ways of looking at things. Have a wonderful rest of the week. Enjoy the holiday, 4th of July, and should be a nice introduction to what's going to be a beautiful Shabbos coming up.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
have a great
Rabbi.
rest of the
Thank
week.
you,
Okay.
Rabbi.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.